Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
This is Kevin Lanahan, Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Communications for the NYISO, and welcome to another edition of the Power Trends podcast. Today, we are going to be speaking with Zach Smith, Vice President for System and Resource Planning. Zach joins us today to discuss his department's role in the critical function of preparing the grid for the future. Zach, welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be here.
I think before we dive into the questions, let's set up this discussion for our listeners. And I think it's best to begin where so much of the focus is today, and that's on the new state statutory goals for decarbonization and renewable investment. Remind listeners, under that statute, 70% of the state's electricity must come from renewable energy by 2030. 100% of the state's electricity supply must be emissions-free by 2040. And the statute also sets goals for 3,000 megawatts of new storage, 6,000 megawatts of solar, and 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. All that's to be developed and connected to the grid at various different stages along the way by 2035. And really represents a grid and a power system that's going to be unrecognizable from the one we run today. Isn't that right?
It is right. And it's quite a challenge, but we're excited for that challenge. They're ambitious goals, and it is going to result in a significant change to the grid and how we know it today. But we feel confident that we have the right process and support in place to embrace those goals and to enable them. First and foremost is the reliability of the grid. That is our first job, to keep the lights on. But also what planning is be an authoritative source of information, help inform policymakers, help inform generator developers, transmission developers, where are the right places to invest, where might be the choke points and the problem points, and what can we be doing to improve those areas. There's going to be a lot of changes, as you mentioned, to the grid as a result of some of these policy goals. But we think we can enable those policy changes. There's going to be a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and there's going to be a lot of places where the locations that they have to site at may not be the best locations electrically. And we'll have to work with the developers, with the policymakers, with utilities to identify the best way is to get that power to the grid and to New York State ratepayers as a whole.
Walk us through your department, certain functions that you and your team oversee, and walk us through the high points of the comprehensive system planning process, the reliability planning studies, and exactly what process you go through in examining the system so that we can get ready for this enormous change.
We have a planning department of almost 60 people where we focus on assessing the grid as a whole. And in our planning process, we look at between now and 10 years from now and what the problems could be. And we focus on three areas: reliability, economic, and public policy. Our reliability process is intended to identify if there are any reliability issues on the grid. We have to make certain assumptions with that. We have a forecasting department. They look at weather forecasts, climate change. They look at changes in demand, changes in the economy, and how all of that might drive changes on the electric grid. Electric vehicles, for example. What might be the penetration level of electric vehicles on the system now and into the future. All of that has an impact on the reliability of the grid, and we assess all of that. We also have an economic planning process. We identify where choke points are, where congestion points that may lead to new resources such as renewables not being able to get up to the bulk electric grid. So we inform policymakers of that, inform developers of that, and work with those developers and work with the utilities to identify if there are any economic, cost-efficient solutions to address those issues. Third, we also have our public policy planning process that's really targeted right at public policies that may drive the need for transmission. We work closely with the state, specifically the Public Service Commission and the Department of Public Service, to identify where there may be places on the system that could lead to transmission issues, to issues on the grid driven by some of these public policies. Again, basically the delivery of renewable power from upstate to downstate or from one locality, one pocket, out to the rest of the system. The public policy process is intended to encourage competition. We seek competitive solutions from utilities and what are called non-incumbent transmission developers, basically any firm that would like to pursue transmission development in New York State. We evaluate all those solutions to determine what is more efficient or cost effective for the New York system.
Against that backdrop, let's focus a bit on the interconnection process and what we call the class year. Try and demystify what that is for listeners who may not be completely familiar. There's a lot of focus on our interconnection process and that queue. Maybe you can walk through for us what that is and what it's intended to achieve for the grid.
Absolutely. And there is a lot of focus, and rightfully so. Our interconnection process is meant to enable projects to come to fruition, to get on the grid, get connected so that they can participate in the New York markets.
So this is where those batteries and those solar installations are going to stop first in order to be evaluated before they do connect to the grid.
That is right. And we have a process for a series of studies where the core purpose of that is for reliability. It's we need to make sure that when these new projects connect to the grid, be it solar, wind, batteries, or even conventional generation, whenever they connect to the grid, we need to make sure that they do not degrade the reliability of the grid. The idea is to identify the least cost upgrades that are necessary to enable those projects to come on the grid. That is our interest, is least cost upgrades.
Okay, so that was a good explanation, Zach, of our interconnection process. Let's talk a little specifically about the class year process. We just wrapped one up and the major change that we're seeing as we embark on this new class year.
Yeah, great question, Kevin. So in our last class year, referred to as class year 2017, we had 20 to 30 projects, and those projects were a good mix. We are starting to see a pickup in renewable power, and those renewable projects come through our interconnection process to get connected to the grid. But we've also seen conventional generation and some merchant transmission projects be moving through. In that last class year, we experienced some delays, to be frank. And those delays we are now trying to address. We believe we are addressing through some process improvements, because the next class year that's coming up, what we will call class year 2019, we're looking upwards of 100 projects. And nearly all of those projects are renewable projects, wind, solar, and then related to renewables, batteries. And we need to make sure that our process is structured in a way to enable all of those projects to come through, get connected to the grid reliably, but to do so in a timely manner. And we think we've made great strides over the years in making our process more efficient. But at the same time, Class Year 17 showed us that there's room for improvement. My team has worked very hard this year to make those improvements. We're very confident that for Class Year 2019, we will have addressed some of those delays. And we've been working very closely with all of these renewable and battery developers to find the fastest way through the process while still maintaining reliability on the grid.
Can you describe just a couple of those changes for us? Simplify it and describe for listeners exactly what it is that we're trying to improve.
In the last class year 2017, one of the significant delays we experienced was related to what are called system deliverability upgrades. And to put that simply, those are upgrades on the system that would be necessary for a project to participate in our capacity market. The reason for those upgrades is because we find their power would not be deliverable when it's needed to customers, to the whole grid.
Goes back to that reliability function.
Exactly. We need to, if we're going to be paying them in the capacity market to count on that power for reliability, we need to know that that power can get from point A to point B without being constrained. So that's the point of the upgrades. That general concept is not going away, but we are proposing to restructure when it is that we evaluate it and how we evaluate it. In past class years, it has been part of a serial process where all of that work has to get done before we declare that that class year is complete and we can move on to the next one to assess the next pool of projects. We are now proposing to carve that assessment out, set it to the side, let that pursue on a parallel track. Meanwhile, we can pick up the next pool of projects and just keep that assembly line moving right along while not jeopardizing the reliability of the grid.
So that's an improvement that is really trying to address speed and efficiency. So it represents our awareness that there's going to be more of these facilities that want to connect to the grid. The state has these goals. We're trying to enable reaching those goals in the most efficient manner.
That's exactly right. And we are working closely with developers, with policymakers, with state agencies such as DPS and NYISO, understanding from them what they see coming based on their policies, based on the regulations, and also working with developers to understand, where they expect to be locating these plants and facilities, such that we can be proactive in trying to identify areas of the system that need to be addressed. We're always poised to address them through the interconnection process, but we hope to be able to address them in other ways as well, proactively.
And it's not as simple, if you can talk a little bit about this, as addressing each project individually on its own. We have to look at the impact that all of these applications and assets are going to have regionally and on the entire system.
That's correct. And I should have described that with the class year. That's the reason for that term, the class year, because any given project, it's going to have impacts of its own on the system. But when you start looking at multiple facilities, like if you have an area where there are multiple wind farms, solar facilities, batteries, all being located in the same general vicinity, they're likely to have compounding impacts on the electric grid in that area. And when you look at any single facility by itself, you may not identify those impacts. The purpose of the class year is to pool them together, look at it all at the same time, and to understand collectively what impact they may have on the grid, identify the least cost upgrades that are necessary in order to accommodate all of those resources. And then we work through what ends up being an iterative process with those developers to determine how the costs will be allocated for those upgrades. The developers get the option of accepting or rejecting their cost allocation, and it's an iterative process down until we have everyone accept.
So the process contemplates reliability. That's everything. And that's at the heart of everything that we do. It also contemplates those least cost solutions for the benefit of consumers.
That's right. And that is exactly the intention of it. The core of the process is the reliability of the grid. But the idea of it is to identify the least cost. And those are the official words in our tariff that tells us how to conduct the process. It says we shall find the least cost solution. And that's the exact reason, is those costs are first borne by the generator, but because they're borne by the generator who participates in the market, ultimately that we would expect that to be passed on to ratepayers. We want to find the least cost solution for ratepayers.
How could additional generation, whether it be intermittent or traditional generation, degrade the grid? We've got to look at the impact that those additional facilities and electrons might have on the existing system. Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, there's a number of technical issues that we have to assess. Some of them are the capabilities of substations and whether those substations can handle the amount of power that's coming through them. So that can be in terms of the abilities of the breakers within that substation, the design of the substation, whether that can handle the amount of power coming through. Some of the transmission, sub-transmission distribution lines that have to carry that power. And, that's all based on facility ratings, facility design. And we have to assess all of that. And sometimes those facilities simply weren't in the first place designed for these new generators to connect in where they're connecting in. So it really is effectuating change in the system to identify how we can best accommodate these new resources and do it in a least cost manner.
So we're seeing some generators exiting the system as well. Maybe walk us through your responsibilities under a scenario where a plant is planning to retire, because we're starting to see some of that as the system moves towards this more renewable future.
We are starting to see it, and we think it's a great indication of markets working efficiently. We see less efficient generation now retiring because it's being replaced by new, more efficient generation, cleaner generation. And we expect that pace to pick up over the next number of years, particularly driven by some of the policies like the CLCPA. And as these generators leave the system, we take a look at, can the bulk electric grid still deliver that power to customers in a reliable fashion? And sometimes we identify issues, whether it's very localized, right where the generator is located. Sometimes it can be very broad across the system, where we look at the probability of resources being available across the entire New York state.
Okay, Zach, so what is typically on people's minds when we do talk about generator deactivation is Indian Point, scheduled to begin deactivation in 2020. So it's coming up. We get a lot of questions about the impact that will have on the system. You've studied it through your process. Can you describe that process?
Absolutely. So Indian Point Energy Center is a 2,000 megawatt, roughly, nuclear facility in the lower Hudson Valley. Consists of 2 generators. Each one is about 1,000 megawatts. As you noted, one is scheduled to retire in 2020, the second in 2021. Those are coming up soon, but we've been planning for them for quite some time. So we have accounted for that for a number of years now in our reliability planning process. And when the discussion of Indian Point retiring first started to come up, there were concerns about the reliability of the grid and what impact that could have. 2,000 megawatts is a lot relative to the New York system, and particularly the location that it's in. It's a good share of that lower Hudson Valley and New York City demand. But we have, through our process, we assessed that deactivation, that retirement. We made sure that we have plans in place to still maintain reliability in the near term and the long term, looking at that 10-year planning horizon. So we have found that while we are subtracting the 2,000 megawatts from Indian Point, through the customer demand flattening, through energy efficiency, and also through various additions of generation in that area, plus planned transmission upgrades coming into that area, putting all of that into combination, we are very confident of maintaining reliability and keeping the lights on after the retirement of Indian Point.
You just mentioned customer demand flattening. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that for folks that aren't completely familiar. What are those trends and what do we see going out 10, 20 years with regard to demand?
Demand is essentially flat. And the reason for that, the core demand, the actual electric usage from consumers is actually going up. But when we take into account the impact the energy efficiency initiatives are having, and this includes something as simple as light bulbs going from incandescence to compact fluorescence to LEDs. From that progression, it has resulted in very significant energy savings that otherwise would have resulted in energy usage going up. So that's an example. There are all kinds of codes and standards that are driving more efficient appliances, those kinds of things. We do see it starting to climb again, going towards the end of that 10-year horizon. A perfect example are vehicles. Transportation sector is the highest emitting sector in terms of CO2 across any sector in the economy. And as transportation moves from gasoline-powered vehicles, which of course emit CO2, to electric vehicles, that of course will have the impact of reducing CO2 emissions, but on our side, it will result in increased electric demand. So our forecasting group is working very diligently to try to understand what that penetration rate will be. We monitor the number of charging stations across the state. That's one way, that's one metric we use to monitor exactly what the adoption rate is. And we're seeing it pick up. And we expect that within 5 to 6 years, it will ramp up significantly such that it will start to pick up our demand. And we have to be poised to be able to handle that.
What are some of the other indicators that you look at in the context of electrification, specifically on commercial and residential buildings in New York City? That's going to be a game changer. What are the challenges there in predicting what the impacts will be on the system? Because that's one thing that you're looking at very closely.
It is a challenge. We work with a number of our end-use customers like New York City and a number of entities in that area to try to understand what movement is happening with the design of buildings, just the design of buildings alone. In general, we're tracking the economy also, not just nationwide economy and not just statewide economy, but local economies and how those local economies will drive efficiencies and drive development. We see building development right now in New York City. You go down to New York City, you see new buildings coming up. And what we look at is how are those new buildings being designed and how efficient are they going to be? Because that ultimately impacts what our customer demand is that we see on our end.
Quick question. When was the last time we had any meaningful investment in the transmission system here in New York?
It's been almost exactly 30 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we're involved in the process of helping to identify the best solutions for those investments in coordination with the state. I'm wondering if you can walk us through that process and then detail for us, because there has been some progress made recently in the context of transmission investments.
This is an area that I'm very excited about, if for nothing else, because it has been 30 years since any development has been achieved on this front. And we have made progress. We have seen some constraint points on the electric grid for quite some time. And those are the areas that we felt we needed to address most quickly. So over the recent years, we've worked closely with the state to help identify what areas of the grid those are that need to be addressed.
Geographically, just generally, where are those for listeners?
Sure. The first one that came up was called Western New York. The facility in general is in the Buffalo area. It's east of Buffalo. That's the project that got selected, and it's in its development phase now. The next set of projects that recently were selected, just generally referred to as the AC transmission projects, those are significant upgrades to be able to move power, because we forecast a significant amount of renewable power in upstate, to move that renewable power from upstate to downstate, and we didn't have that capability. So where the upgrades would be was from the Utica area going towards the Albany area, generally along the Mohawk Valley, and then another segment starting just south of the Albany area, moving down towards Poughkeepsie.
And this will help alleviate what we've, a phrase that we've coined, the tale of two grids, where upstate is made up of mostly carbon-free resources, nuclear, hydro, and a lot of wind. And as you documented for us earlier, there's going to be much more wind sited in upstate New York. And then that downstate region where there's the demand is greatest, and being able to move all of those carbon-free electrons down through the Hudson Valley to where that demand is greatest.
That's right. We are seeing that today, even in today's energy mix. The quote, tale of two grids really is true today. We see it just being amplified in the future because of the sites where wind has to locate, because you have to put wind where the wind blows, and that tends to be in the upstate area. And also where we're seeing a lot of solar development. And the flip side of that is downstate, we have a lot of aging generation, and we expect to see a number of those facilities retire over the years because of age, but also because they're less efficient. And the economics of all of those resources will drive business decisions, and some of those facilities will have to retire. Those older facilities tend to be in the load centers of New York City, Long Island area, and it'll just increase that demand to move power from upstate to downstate.
We won't walk through the complexities of the public policy transmission planning process, but can you just give us an idea? You identified those two projects, Western New York and then AC transmission, the basic responsibilities that you and your team had in vetting those solutions and those proposals.
It starts with identifying the need in the first place. So we work closely with the state to identify that need. That kind of lays out the scope of what it is we're looking for. So for example, in the case of Western New York, the need was to make sure that we're able to deliver that Niagara hydropower, to deliver renewable power in the Western New York area. And the existing transmission system wasn't capable of that.
I like the term unbottling. It gives us a really clear picture. If we can
That's right.
uncork that, and all of that, those clean resources are there for
That's exactly right. That's exactly what these projects are doing is unbottling or uncorking the constraints. And so in the case of Western New York, we have renewable power that cannot move across the grid to get to ratepayers, to get to consumers. And so we went out to the stakeholders, asked transmission developers, what projects do you have that could address this? It's an open solicitation. We don't define and say this shall be the project that you do. It's an open solicitation to encourage innovation. And so all of these different developers come in with different ideas, and then we compare them to each other. First, we start with comparing them to whatever the need is. So in the case of Western New York, the need was to get that power out of the Western New York area. Then they were good to go on to the next phase. Really, the competition phase is to compare all the projects and to evaluate ultimately which one is the more efficient or cost-effective solution for New York State ratepayers.
So last question on this subject. Obviously, there are other ideas about where there is a public policy need for transmission investment. I think we've commented on that. If you can throw out some roughly geographic areas where we believe that there's some investment necessary.
Sure. We see three areas, and this is all driven by new renewable development. So to describe those briefly, we know that there are targets for the development of offshore wind. The problem is, offshore wind is out in the ocean. First of all, you need to be able to get that to land. Second of all, you need to get it from those points on land to customers. So it's kind of two problems. That is an area that might be ripe for us to work with policymakers, for us to work with developers, both offshore wind developers and transmission developers, in identifying and efficient solutions. Second area is North Country. Right now, we already have a lot of wind located up in the North Country near the Canadian border. The transmission facilities coming down towards the Utica area are constrained, we see that as a so-called no regrets path, where assuming that we'll have further wind and solar development in the future, any improvement of that corridor will be beneficial to ratepayers. And then third, in the western and central New York area, we are seeing pockets of power where you have renewable development out of necessity for where it has to site. And so in order to accommodate that renewable power, there may need to be transmission build-outs in order to accommodate just the volume of renewable power that's getting built.
If we focus on offshore wind just a little bit more, you mentioned the challenges. One of getting that power from the middle of the ocean onto land and then from land to consumers. What are the long-term impacts of putting that those projects in place? How will that, when we think far into the future, change the grid writ large?
It's almost hard to predict at this point because there are so many different ways that you could accommodate the offshore wind. So you have the policy goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. That's a significant goal, and it's going to take significant development to achieve that. You could have what are essentially extension cords out to every single wind farm out there, but that's probably not going to be the most efficient way to do it. So it may be the best to get the wind onshore. It has been suggested by some that could be an offshore grid where you have a system in the ocean where offshore wind could plug into. That is one idea that's out there. But no matter how you do it out in the water, then you have to deal with the secondary effect of, are you able to actually get that power to consumers? And because of the location being in New York City and Long Island, a lot of those consumers are right there. So we did a study recently where it looked at exactly that. And we found that for lower levels than 9,000 megawatts of offshore, because that objective didn't exist yet at that point, but we looked at lower levels and we found that there actually weren't that significant upgrades necessary to actually accommodate it. However, looking at the 9,000 megawatt objective, we think it's very likely that we will need upgrades. And we'll have to find what the most efficient way is to do that. And really the idea is to be able to get it to all consumers, New York City, Long Island, but all of New York State. And we might discover new constraints on our grid that we just have never experienced before because of that amount of power that's now coming in the New York City and Long Island area and possibly flowing upward towards upstate. So it could really change the landscape of the electric grid as we know it today.
I think that's a perfect place to end. And Zach, you got to get back to work because this is just, you got a lot to do.
Luckily, I have a great team that I can rely on. So I'm happy to be here today to talk to you, Kevin.
It's been incredibly informative and really interesting. And these are all this is information and topics that everybody needs to be aware of. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to do it.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.